Hi, this is Randal Schwartz, host of FLOSS Weekly. This week, Dan Lynch joins me to talk with Gilad Bracha about Newspeak, a language that's based on small talk that's going to do some really cool revolutionary stuff. You'll want to hear about this, so stay tuned.
Netcasts you love.
From people you trust.
This is Twit.
Bandwidth for FLOSS Weekly is provided by Cachefly at CACHEFLY.com.
This is FLOSS Weekly with Randal Schwartz and Dan Lynch, episode 159 for March 30th, 2011, Newspeak. It's time for FLOSS Weekly, the show with free, libre, open-source software. I am your host, Randal Schwartz, Merlin at Stonehenge.com, bringing you weekly, or as often as I can get to the big mic here, whatever we want to talk about in terms of the open-source community, the open-source projects that are interesting, the open-source people, the legends, the newbies, the everything we can in between. It's a fun show to do, and I'm glad I get to bring it to you every week. And as I also have every week, nearly every week anyway, I have a co-host. And this week again, it's Dan Lynch. Dan, welcome back to the show.
Hi, good to be here. Great to be back.
Yes, Dan with a new watch.
Yeah, I actually got here really early today. I think we talked about this earlier, but I was here like almost 2 hours early because I really didn't want to make a mistake last time. So yeah, I think we've got that covered now.
And then at exactly an hour early, I actually pinged you and said, "Are you about ready?"
Yeah,
to freak you out. I'm sorry.
Yeah, you caught me out with that. I was quite worried. I started to think I'd got the wrong time again when you did that. But no, I'm certain I've got it all right now. Our clocks have now changed in the UK, so I'm back to 8 hours difference again. So I know where I am.
And for those of you watching on the video, I am once again at my new LA client, Media Temple. So this is not just some random kitchen. This is actually a conference room. And they are graciously providing a place for me to record the show when I'm here on site. When I'm back in Portland, I'll be recording with my Blue Yeti. But these guys got me this really interesting Shure mic, and it has an XLR connector. So they decided to get out and get me a USB connection. So if I sound a little different and occasionally echoey and stuff, it's because I'm still trying to figure out how to use this new mic. So that's what that big giant black thing is poking into my left of my side of my screen there. So thanks to Media Temple for giving me bandwidth and a place to do all the show. So we have a really great show today. I've known this guy or known of his work for a long time. I'm not sure if I've met him or not. I think I met him at one of the Smalltalk conferences. Gilad Bracha, who's big in the Smalltalk community, is working on a new language called Newspeak, which is derived from Smalltalk in that it sort of looks like Smalltalk in terms of the syntax, but it also has features about security and about modularity, being able to compile it in separate sections. It looks like it's going to be really interesting. So I think we're going to have and unfortunately, just telling you flat out as we're going into this, I'm going to get a little geeky in this show. I already know because I love Smalltalk and I think it's a great thing and I think I want more people to know about it. So I have a feeling I'm probably going to get into some pretty heavy, deep questions, but maybe Dan, you can rescue me by kind of asking normal questions after I get done.
Yeah,
okay?
I can ask the stupid questions. Don't worry about it. Not stupid questions. As the old saying goes, there's no such thing as a stupid question. Only one that you haven't asked. Although that's not quite the saying. I've made that up. But there we go. Yeah, I can't wait to hear more about it. It's I'm sure it's going to be educational and fun.
Yeah, and one of the things I appreciate about you, Dan, is that you're really a proxy for most of our audience. When I get really geeky about something, you kind of bring it back to, yeah, but what distro does it run on? And how do I download it? And I forget about that kind of stuff because I'm not that kind of geeky. I'm more the programmer, deep geeky. So I'm glad you're along on this particular ride. So I think you'll be able to balance out my questions pretty well.
Yeah, I'm always ready with any high-tech questions such as what's your favorite color? Things like that. I'm always happy to jump in with those.
All right, great. Well, without further ado, let's go ahead and bring on our guest.
Hi there, Randy. How are you doing?
Doing well. And where are we speaking to you from?
I'm actually sitting in my study at home right now because there's less chance of my getting disturbed in the middle of this than if I actually went to work bright and early.
And in what city are you in?
Los Altos, California.
Oh, very good, very good. So you're sort of halfway between me and LA and the Twit Cottage, which is just north of you. So now that we've done this small talk not about small talk, I did a pretty poor introduction to what Newspeak's all about at the beginning of the show. But let's start by just sort of giving the 30,000 foot view of what's Newspeak and what's your involvement with it.
Okay, Newspeak is a programming language and more than that, a platform that I designed. It's descended from Smalltalk, and I guess it's focused on a few issues that I felt that, despite Smalltalk's many strengths, it wasn't addressing well. And those are mainly modularity, security, and interoperability with the rest of the world outside Smalltalk.
Now, we've already chatted with Dan. Oh, now I'm going to be really mad if I don't remember his last name.
Ingalls?
Yeah, exactly. Dan Ingalls. Oh, he's going to hate me for that. I just drew a blank. Not enough caffeine yet. We spoke with Dan Ingalls and got some of the early history of Smalltalk, but just for people that are listening to this show for fresh, where did Smalltalk come from, and where is it now, and why are you taking Newspeak sort of standing on that in the next generation? What's missing in Smalltalk that makes you want to do this? Okay,
so Smalltalk was the programming language designed at Xerox PARC, actually one of several, but that's the one that, for example, they showed a demo of to Steve Jobs, and he understood what a computer could really do based on that. It's the same time frame, the 70s till 1980, where pretty much they invented much of modern computing, right? GUIs, Ethernet, all that good stuff. And so its problem has generally been that it was way ahead of its time, and so its time has never quite come because it's different than what most people are used to in the mainstream. And that's just something of a liability. It's had some weaknesses which I'm trying to address, which may account, why it never really caught on in a big way. One of its weaknesses is that it's not very good at playing with the rest of the world. It's sort of traditionally been a world unto its own, which is part of the history because there was no real rest of the world when they started on this. This thing ran on the first personal computers, on the Alto, before there were standards, long before Windows or even Macs and so forth. So that tends to be a problem. Another problem is modularity, and another problem is security because it comes from, again, long before people were aware of viruses and Trojan horses and all these problems. Its goal was different. Its goal was to actually be a very open system that anyone could modify, anyone could play with, and that's why it has these very powerful reflective facilities. The problem is that it's an actually ugly, nasty world out there, and that doesn't mesh well with security. So these are the points that I've tried to address while preserving what's really cool about it, which is this enormous flexibility and power you get to modify anything, and the cleanliness of it all. A really beautiful system.
Okay, and just to really address that point about Smalltalk, and since I do happen to be a Smalltalk expert, in Smalltalk you can load a chunk of code in, and it has access to the entire system all the way down to the VM level. In that, any piece of Smalltalk code that you load could patch what object does, the sort of the top level class, could actually make it do something different depending on how I want to do it. So there's no modularity at all in the traditional Smalltalk system. Although I'm sure haven't there been commercial Smalltalks that have tried to address this modularity issue?
Yes, there have. There have been, not all Smalltalks would let you quite get into the VM level that easily as, say, Dan system, which is Squeak does, which is probably the most flexible in that respect. There are several commercial Smalltalk systems, but they do have, what they term solutions to modularity. I have rather higher standards for what modularity means. And in any case, your ability to go and mess with things in the system, such as object, is really not inhibited by those schemes. What those schemes let you do is package those changes so that you can, decide to separate them and distribute them separately. But the fact is that you can still go and mess with stuff in very sort of the mother of all monkey patching, I guess you could call it.
Yeah, and that leads to issues about possibly, and you also have complications. Like if one piece of code that I load legitimately wants to add certain methods to object or a fairly important class, and then another thing that I bring in wants to also add methods to object or a very important class, and they conflict, then we have an image that won't work because those two things are all really ultimately in the same monolithic image. Is this also something that Newspeak was trying to address?
To some extent, yes. Now, reality and goals still differ here because we're still running on Squeak Smalltalk, so everything can be undermined by going out into the Squeak system. But the idea is that we have a really powerful concept of modularity at the language level, which, among other things, lets us control who can do what to whom. And that's probably, at this point, I don't think I should get into the details of that. Maybe, a little while later as we discuss reflective APIs and structures and how things are done. But yes, that is something we're trying to address.
Very cool. Very cool. Now, where are you in the project at this point? I know that you had some releases, I think, a couple of years ago, or at least some talk about releases a couple of years ago, or maybe just talking about it. I'm not quite sure. But where is it in the cycle of things?
Okay, so maybe I'll just give you a quick history of the project, and that'll. So the project started out in late 2006 at Cadence, and the actual goal there was to build a product for computer-aided design. That's what Cadence largely does, and somehow we got someone who was enlightened enough to actually say, well, we can be more productive and use some non-mainstream technology, which is very unusual and a great opportunity. And we set out to improve Smalltalk, as it were, which is a very ambitious thing because Smalltalk's fabulous, really, but to address those issues that I've alluded to. And so that ran till late 2008 when the world sort of almost came to an end. And in the ensuing financial panic, Cadence was in not great shape, putting it very mildly. And they basically shut down anything that smacked of advanced development research. We were an incubation, as it were. And even though we had customers and things, basically it was very early stage. And the bottom line for them was we weren't bringing in as much money as we cost at that point. So they really had no resources to spare. They shut down their research lab. They shut down all their incubation. They didn't think, very far ahead, frankly. And so the project as a funded commercial thing ended at that point. Shortly thereafter, we did our first release as open source. Fortunately, we had the foresight to get it open sourced. And we did another release. We did a couple of interim releases, and the last one was about a year later in February 2010. And I wanted to do another one, but it hasn't happened yet for a variety of reasons. We've done a lot of work since, but getting this into a stable version that I feel people can just go and use for a new release hasn't happened because all these changes have actually destabilized the system somewhat. So at this point, we're an open source project with a very small number of volunteers. Usually they're like students and stuff who are doing thesis work, academic work that can be done nicely in Newspeak and pushes the state of the art in some of these things. And, we're in the afterlife, as it were.
Okay, that's interesting. So you actually are looking for more collaborators, more people to bring in, and sort of have mostly an academic background, or I mean, I'm a street trained programmer, so would I be of any value to you?
I'm sure you'd be of enormous value. I don't care if they're academic training is a double-edged sword. I've been unlearning what I learned in my PhD studies for the past 18 or 20 years. And eventually I might get somewhere. So I'm perfectly happy to have people who have practical skills. That complements nicely the sort of research and programming language skills. The main thing I'm looking for is people with an open mind, right? People who do not expect everything to be exactly the same as they're used to.
And that's one of the things we notice as I'm trying to introduce Smalltalk to people is like it's just as elegant as I see it being, and as practical actually as I see it being now with things like Seaside and Squeak being multi-platform and actually many implementations understanding Seaside and things like that. It seems that it's so different for people who are used to C and C++ and Java. The constraints that those languages provide, they kind of look at Smalltalk like, that's just running around playing in a field. I want to bring out my tools and actually construct a building. You're telling me just go play in the field and it just works. And I go, well, no, that's part of the advantage of it. So you're having the same sort of uphill grind a little bit with Newspeak then, right?
Oh, absolutely. So part of this is just, I take this a view of learning as brain damage. Once you learn a certain style, a certain pattern, you're much less open to other solutions that overlap with it.
Mhm.
And as a result, because people are so used to everything, right? The syntax, the conventions in the mainstream, they have a very hard time doing things in a way that's different, even if that way is frankly way better. So yes, that's a huge uphill struggle and perhaps a sort of pointless one. But to me, the idea of Newspeak is to do things right. And so I've considered, selling out and compromising. And what if I did a version that had sort of mainstream syntax and stuff? And, I'm not, at this point, I'm not inclined to do that. And I'm looking for people who are willing to learn something new.
Interesting.
And it's a competitive advantage, really, in some sense, that people don't, that it isn't widely used, because if you're willing to use it and if you have the freedom to use it, which is sometimes hard, obviously, if you're in a bigger company or something, but if you can use it, you can actually be so much more productive that it's a big advantage.
So I know that some of our audience probably isn't familiar with Smalltalk, but I'm going to have to presume, a certain degree of this in order to continue the conversation here. So given, if I already know Smalltalk, or at least have a dabbling in it, how's Newspeak going to look different to me?
Well, it's going to look different if you look at individual snippets of code, not much will look different. The syntax is quite similar. We could go into details what's different, but it's fairly minor.
Mm-hmm.
What's different is you're going to have to think about classes nesting, because that's a big part of how the system differs and how it works and what gives it its power.
Mm-hmm.
Classes actually have a syntax, so you can put a Newspeak class in a file, and it isn't just a file out. For those who know what that is in Smalltalk,
Mm-hmm.
it is an actual piece of syntax that more like a conventional class declaration, say in Java, though syntactically it's a little different. In fact, the overall structure isn't that different. What's different is really the expressions, which are Smalltalky inside the methods and so forth. So at a cursory glance, you see something that looks vaguely familiar like a class, and then you look inside it and it becomes increasingly unfamiliar unless you're a Smalltalker, in which case it's just exactly the other way around.
I guess that's the greatest way to put it, at least for now. One of the things I remember is, and I haven't spent a lot of time looking at it, I'm sort of embarrassed that I haven't really been following this project as close as I should, especially before this show. But one of the things I remember when I saw it was that when a class was compiled, it was handed like the world it lived in, like what the globals were, what kinds of other parts of the system it could access, and so on. And this was part of your security aspect of it. Can you go into what that's about?
Yeah, so I'll that's roughly accurate, and I'll make it more accurate as I explain.
Yeah.
So the idea, one of the really unusual things about Newspeak is that there's no global namespace. So there are no globals as such. A top-level class basically doesn't have a surrounding scope. It's completely independent of the rest of the world. And that means that all the names in the class have to come from the class itself. They have to be declared in the class. Well, technically, they have to be members of the class. Let's put it that way. Now, the only way they can be that is either you declared them, or they could be inherited from object. Basically, implicitly, there's object is the superclass, and so there are the class object again, unlike Smalltalk, is very small and doesn't have zillions of methods. But it does have a few things, and that's where all the names come from. So this raises the question, well, how do I talk to the rest of the world? And the idea is that every class has a factory method, or possibly several, but let's keep it simple. You have a factory method, and the only way you're going to connect an instance of this class to the rest of the world is going to be by providing arguments to that factory method. And one, very typically, not always, but in most cases, one of those arguments, or perhaps the only one, would be a platform argument, an object that reifies the entire platform. It's going to represent, all the stuff that the standard platform might give you, like collections library, streams library, things like that. And you'll take that object and you'll call, say, collections on it, and that call would return you a collections library, an object representing a collections library. And you'd call something like list or map or something on that, and you'd get the map class. And then you could use it. And so and what you typically do as an idiom is in the factory method, essentially in the instance initializer, you're going to take this platform parameter, ask it for the things you need for this particular class, and store them in instance variables of the class. And those will then be available to the rest of the code in the class, right? So this works very well not only for security. It wasn't primarily motivated by security. It just happens to work for that. It was motivated by modularity. Because now these top-level classes, they can be compiled independently, regardless of, you don't need any other code around. They can be loaded in any order because they really don't depend on anything else. And it's when you actually want to build a working application that you have to wire them together, sort of like a make file, if you will. You have to specify how they're going to be connected to each other. And we can detail how that works. So it's all a little different. But it means that all the stuff that you depend on is going to be listed in that instance initializer explicitly as, here I'm getting this class from the platform, or I'm getting this argument that represents some other third-party library that isn't part of the platform but needs to be a parameter so that I can get at it. And you look at a top-level Newspeak class and you know exactly what it uses, what it depends on from the outside world, which is very, very different from Smalltalk, where it's, frankly, spaghetti. It's really, really hard to track down what interconnections between all the pieces of the code are.
Yeah, right now, as an example, every class that you compile in standard Smalltalk has access to the Smalltalk dictionary, which is really sort of the top-level global namespace. So if I use, say, an array class, if I have the array class name in a method, it's really referring to the array element of the Smalltalk global dictionary. So you're saying you've eliminated that by having a parameter you pass in that says, here's your world, and go find array class within that, right?
Right, and what that gives you, the difference is that now it is the configuration that's external to the class that decides what that class can see. Because the class can say, okay, I'd like to get, say, to files. I want to write to files, and I want to get to the files library. But it's up to, it doesn't do that implicitly. It has to actually get a parameter that gives it access to that. So say in a setting where you do not want code to write to the file system, you can give it a platform object that doesn't have an accessor that'll get it to the files module. Or you can give it an accessor that gives it read-only access to the files. Or that warns you that they're trying to do that, when they shouldn't, and so forth. So you can, by controlling what the incoming parameters to the class factory are, you can institute what's known as object capability-based security. You can restrict access by simply not providing the objects that have the power to do things you don't want that code to do.
Sounds like it'd also be useful in testing, because I know one of the hardest things I have when I'm testing is to keep this thing that normally wants to write directly to the file system from writing to the file system. So it sounds like if I could compile my class in a test framework and say, when you're trying to write to the file, you're really going to write to my data structure so I can see what you were writing. It sounds like it'd be great for that.
Right, and we actually have, the IDE supports a very nice unit testing framework that isn't descended. The release actually has a thing called NSUnit that is a variant, a Newspeak variant of SUnit. But we've since then done something nicer called Minitest, which really is a lot simpler and takes advantage of the hierarchical structure of Newspeak programs to do that. And yes, you basically, part of that is you specify a configuration for how you want to hook up those modules that you want to test, and you can give them objects that are mock objects. It's very natural. You never have to change anything in your original code, and even if you have zero experience and you're a new developer, you cannot screw this up, because you can never actually tie yourself to a specific dependency.
So just to kind of back up a little bit from the technical stuff, I have to confess I'm not a Smalltalk expert, unlike Randal, who is. So I'm curious. This must be something you get asked quite a lot, but there's a lot of people who complain about the proliferation of everything, really, from software licenses to programming languages and things like that. So how do you deal with people saying to you, why do we need this language? And, isn't it wouldn't it be better to put this work into another existing language? What's your answer to that kind of thing?
Well, my answer is that some things aren't fixable in existing languages. These are very fundamental properties, and if you're satisfied with the kind of software development that you have, if you really think that's the way it should be and that's as good as it can be, then you deserve what you're using and stick with it. I'm not there to force anyone to do anything. If you realize how truly unnecessarily complicated and broken it is, because you get this hodgepodge of sort of improvisations trying to get around these problems. So the complexity isn't the, introducing a new language doesn't make your life more complex if that language itself is very simple. What makes your life complex is finding this problem that, for example, in large-scale software development, you find that something like static calls or constructors or whatever hook you up, tie you, and hardwire your dependencies to something, and then you have to undo them. And saying, oh, now I need to know about dependency injection frameworks. And now I need to know about OSGI and the amount of complexity using the mainstream because the fundamental concepts are frankly broken. That's where the problem comes from. Newspeak is ridiculously simple. And yes, sometimes you have to start from the ground up.
Yeah, that makes sense. It's the old, you can't make an omelette without breaking some eggs kind of metaphor, I suppose. I'm curious about the kind of the goals of the project and so on. Though, is it meant to be a practical, real world language to be used, or is it more of a kind of an academic learning framework or something like that?
Okay, so it was meant and still is meant to some extent to be a very practical thing to be used. Remember, the development of this was done in the context of an incubation that had a product to deliver. And we had to, deliver stuff to actual customers for early access and stuff. And we had real programmers who were, several of whom had never seen Smalltalk before, let alone this language that hadn't existed. And we had to produce something that they could use. And in particular, we couldn't tell them, you know what, give me 2 years, I'll come up with something really nice. Basically, that was one of the reasons it was good to start with we're based on Squeak, because we had to start with something that at least had some conceptual relationship to what we were trying to do. And what we did is we gradually moved them from one dialect of Newspeak that was sort of fixed some Smalltalk issues to another. We started out with a thing called NS0 and then NS1, and then NS2 is what's in the release, and we've got NS3, which we haven't released yet, which, again, is largely a lot like NS2. Most of the key concepts are there, but, again, getting it to comply with a spec, various shortcuts that were taken so that we could get things out the door, it's more compliant and closer to the ideal that we had. But definitely, we've spent an enormous amount of effort on engineering tasks that we wouldn't if this was an academic exercise, right? We have an IDE, we have testing frameworks, we have foreign function interfaces, we have we have a lot of, that's why I said it's not just a language, it's a platform. Doing a language would be easy. You just do a batch compiler, it takes a file, it spits out a file, and you're done. The bar in the Smalltalk world tends to be higher. You expect a lot of facilities, and if you know what you're doing, you can really use this for real stuff. If you don't know what you're doing, well, you're going to use something standard, and God help you anyway.
So something I was curious about is the kind of the simplicity of the language and the syntax. Do you think it would be possible to teach children Newspeak in the way that you may be able to teach them Smalltalk? Is that possible, do you think?
Sure, you can teach children almost anything. Now, I'd say that the focus in Newspeak, because it's more about software engineering issues, that's the difference from Smalltalk, right? These are not issues that will speak to children, right? So right. You would naturally teach them something like Smalltalk, which is what Smalltalk was really originally designed to do, and maybe one of the reasons it doesn't address these issues. If you know Smalltalk, the transition isn't that hard. You have to unlearn a few habits, but children are much better at that than adults. So, if in my son's high school, they have a Java class for whatever reason. I figure that by the time they're willing to expose kids to something like Java, it would have been better to teach them Smalltalk at a younger age and then say, okay, now you need to know about, complications and discipline and so forth in the later years. And but I'm not interested, to be honest, in that aspect. That's been a big part of the Smalltalk culture, but this is about commercial software engineering.
Right. Yeah, of course. I'm curious about what I need to kind of get started with this. So approaching this as a person who maybe doesn't know Smalltalk very well, or at all, in fact, do I need to know Smalltalk in order to learn Newspeak, or could I just start with Newspeak and learn from there? Would you think you need an understanding?
I think you can certainly start directly with Newspeak. We have if you download the release, there is a tutorial of sorts. It's probably not quite adequate. It probably still has implicit assumptions about Smalltalk knowledge in there, even though, there's a guide to the syntax and so forth. It may not be enough. It really helps to know Smalltalk, but it's certainly not essential, right? It's like any other. My view is that a competent professional should be able to pick up any programming language given, a half-decent description. And it's largely a matter of motivation. And, I could try and put thousands of programmers at gunpoint and make them learn it, but I don't have the ammunition. So I try persuasion. It doesn't seem to work quite as well, but that's the way we're going. So, yeah, you download it and you try. We have a forum. Because we have, frankly, so few people, we're good at answering questions. It takes a while, right? I think it does take a while. If you've been poisoned by the mainstream, it'll take, it's a step definitely to learn something that different. But you'll find once you really grok it, you'll find that it really can do a lot with very little mechanism. It's really simple.
So you mentioned that you can download it and try it and all that kind of stuff. So it runs on top of Squeak, and I know Squeak is cross-platform. So do I need to install Squeak first and then get Newspeak as well, or anything else?
No, you don't. And in fact, it won't even help you. It may hinder you because for various reasons, we've made a few small changes to the Squeak VM. Small but fairly crucial to make, our method lookup is a little different, and it's fairly critical that this is done well. Otherwise, you hit really bad performance problems and such. And so the download comes complete with the appropriate VM. And if you have Squeak installed, it may just, you might occasionally, people complain about the install that, it tries to open an image with a Squeak VM instead and that doesn't run and so forth. So you're actually better off the less Squeak is involved. You just the download is self-contained.
Okay, and it will run on any kind of Linux, Unix type system or Windows, presumably.
It'll run on Windows. It'll run on Macs. It'll run on Linux now. Any kind of Linux. I'll never swear to that. There's an infinite number of them. I believe people have been fine with the major Linuxes, Red Hat, Ubuntu. I can't track them all. But in theory, it definitely runs on Linux, but your Linux may differ.
Yeah, of course. Well, as you say, there's so many flavors out there. It could be almost anything. So I'm curious about the kind of, and I hope Randal will forgive me for this, but the comparisons to Java in some ways. I know he's not a huge fan of Java, but I'm wondering if this would ever replace something like Java in the future. Do you think that's possible?
Well, okay. So I don't know how much you guys are aware, but I've had a fair amount of involvement with Java. And I worked at Sun and was responsible for the Java language specs. So I know its flaws better than anyone, I dare say, because what my job involved basically, I was sort of at the morgue and they delivered the dead bodies to me, whenever there was one of these languagey platform issues that people were complaining about, it very often ended at my desk, which... So, familiarity breeds contempt to some degree because you only hear about the bad things. No one writes to tell you how good it is. Well, that's not true. Occasionally people do, but you get far more complaints. So, technically, could it replace Java? Of course, it's much better. But, with caveats, you'll never get quite the same performance. I mean, currently you won't get anywhere near the performance because Squeak is not a very fast implementation. But the upper bound, I think, on performance on a system like this is probably well-engineered, is still a good way off from Java, probably 60-70% of Java speed if you really engineered a VM for it with a lot more resources than we are ever likely to have. So as a practical matter, do I expect to take over the world? Sadly, no. you asked what the goals of the project were. Of course, they were to make me rich and famous, but they're not necessarily. It's good to have goals, but they're not necessarily attainable. I don't kid myself that this is likely to take over the world anytime soon. And I think that one of the problems Java created for programming language designers was this expectation of, whatever I do, I should take over the world. I think in that respect, my attitude is I'd love it to take over the world, but I want it to have enough of a base that it exists, and enough so that when I need to program, I can use it, and I don't have to I can avoid dealing with the nastiness of the mainstream. And the ideas inspire things. So that's a bit of a more academic attitude, right? The ideas do eventually have an impact. To some extent, Smalltalk's ideas had a big impact on Java, not nearly enough. I like to say everything good in Java comes from Smalltalk, everything bad in it comes from C++. So, it is this kind of balance, and you can argue whether the balance should have been different, but it's likely that the balance was just perfect in order to get adoption. And obviously, Newspeak is not balanced to get adoption. Newspeak is balanced to do the right thing, which is very different from adoption.
Sounds very cool. I didn't. I have to confess, I didn't know your relationship to Java, so I apologize for that. But I was just mentioning to Randal that speaking of rich and famous, I noticed that James Gosling has just started a new job at Google this week. I'm not sure what he's going to be doing there, but obviously another Java guy. So I'm curious. Could you run Newspeak in a browser? What kind of things would I use it for? Practically, I suppose. Say I want to develop something in Newspeak. What sort of things do people use it for?
Okay, so could you run it in a browser? As a practical matter, not yet, but very, very close. As a theoretical matter, of course, and that, frankly, was one of my goals almost from day one, right? Because when this started in 2006, by that point, it was clear that the browser where things were happening, and that ideally, my view is that JavaScript should be treated as an assembly language. It's not a good assembly language, but it's what we're stuck with. And so the problem was, of course, that Cadence had different priorities, right? If I was doing this, if some charitable billionaire had decided to just give me a pile of money and do this, then we would have focused on the browser right away. At Cadence, this was far outside their range of interests, and so we worked a lot on, for instance, on Windows, for example, the native Windows GUI and such. But we have done some work in the open source world on a Newspeak to JavaScript compiler, and we've done some more work on it at SAP. And one of the exercises I still have to go through is, again, get SAP to license the changes that we've made so that we can actually put them out for people. We basically have a working Newspeak to JavaScript compiler, and but we don't have the entire platform, so we don't have the same GUI. One of our goals was that you would write an application, and you wouldn't care if it was going to the browser or if it was going to somewhere else, right? The same app could run completely on the client in the browser, or it could run on Windows or Mac or whatever, and it would essentially, really do what Java failed to do, which is write once, run anywhere. And I think I still believe that's doable, but it's a fair amount of work to do the GUI, to do some of the fancy reflective stuff. JavaScript makes a lot of this incredibly painful. And right now, we just have the basic compiler. So you could write an application that called the DOM, right? We have a way of talking back and forth to JavaScript from Newspeak when we do this. And you could write an application, but you'd have to drive the GUI the old, the crummy way with talking to the DOM or some API you built on top of that, much like, say, the Seaside APIs. And so it's doable. It isn't available to the public yet. There's still, a lot of engineering to be done. Performance isn't where we'd like it to be on that. We lose a lot of performance in this process. And, we believe we'll eventually get close to native JavaScript speed, but maybe I'm kidding myself. There's still too many unknowns. We haven't these are things that unless you do them, you're never sure how it'll work, right? You have a theory, I could do this or I could do that. And it's a challenge, but we are looking into that. And I hope there will be because that's one thing I think we're much more likely to get people to try and use it if they can deploy to the web directly.
Well, now that's the third Smalltalk to Java compiler or JavaScript compiler that I've heard about. So there was the one that Dan did a couple years ago, and I think that sort of stalled somewhere. But at this last month's STS, I heard that there was this description of JTalk. Were you around for the JTalk presentation? And what do you think of that?
I know there's Clamato. I know there's, is it JTalk? I saw something else. I've seen at least two. I don't actually realize that Dan's done Lively Kernel, which is actually a Morphic-like thing, but it's in pure JavaScript. It isn't a Smalltalk to JavaScript thing. He may have experimented with the compiler. To be honest, I've looked at a couple of those, and, they have not gone far. I mean, my goal is to make the real system work. You find that they have either cheated on the semantics where it's hard to implement efficiently, so it isn't the real deal. The libraries are very, very limited. Again, we want GUI. Eventually, what I'd like to do, and that's pretty ambitious, is to have the whole IDE run in a browser. And that, that might require some sort of plugin, because debugging in JavaScript is actually something that's very, there aren't the right primitives to write our debugger directly without at least the developer mode, right?
Debugging is definitely going to be a problem, because that you can't run multiple threads in classic JavaScript engines. So I don't know if that's going to be an issue. But I really think you should take a look at JTalk, because they do actually have the full class browser with editable panes where you can actually go in and make new code directly in the JavaScript browser or in the web browser. So I think there's probably an overlap of stuff. They're starting with the basic, they're trying to be Pharo compatible. So that would be a Squeak variant called Pharo. They're trying to be very compatible with that, all the way down to the level of objects. So the same calls on object actually call the same things coming in. I think it's going to be really interesting to see where they take that.
It is interesting. As I said, these things, to be perfectly honest, it's great that people are doing this. They are a long way from the reality. They don't have the right semantics. They do not have the full libraries. Making a class browser that looks vaguely like a class browser is one thing. Making, what a real Smalltalk system does is a very, very different thing, right? You can get sort of the 60% impression very quickly, and you find that the last 10% is more work than all the rest, because you start to hit the issues. If we wanted to do that, that's very easy. We're already beyond that point, I'd say. The challenge is to do something that really meets the expectations of the full experience, and that is there are no shortcuts there. It's really
when I show people the Smalltalk browser, and they say, well, it looks just like Eclipse or something, and I go, yeah, but can you do this? And then I show a piece of code and refactor it, or a piece of code and go look up all the senders of this, and it's like, oh no, it doesn't do all that yet. So yeah, I know exactly what you mean. So this thing in JTalk does in fact have the standard 4 panes and the big code pane below, but it does nothing beyond that. So I know what you're saying about there's still a long ways to go there.
Right.
I'm also curious though, the other thing I was looking at in terms of having this run in the browser, perhaps, is having an actual embedded plugin that was the VM, the classic Smalltalk VM, or Newspeak VM anyway. But the code you're sending down, because of this packaging thing, because of this environment thing that you're passing as parameters, could effectively be sandboxed the same way that Java and JavaScript is sandboxed. Have you thought about that sort of an implementation?
Well, obviously it can be, and it is, and it's sandboxed. It's much more effectively sandboxed than Java or JavaScript, because the language is providing this. So that's easy enough, because the way we deploy, because things are so modular, it's very easy for us to identify. And again, this is a big difference from traditional Smalltalk. It's very easy for us to identify what the code of an application is, right? Whereas in Smalltalk, it's really hard to decide where your application ends. And so we can very easily, essentially, we serialize an object representing the application, and we can serialize that into a pile of JavaScript code, which basically has exactly the code, the translation of the classes that you need for your application in JavaScript, and that's what we send to the browser. Plus, it depends. If it's an actual browser that doesn't have anything plugged in, then we have to send the platform as well. So it gets to be a fairly large, the browsers are very fast these days, but you need to basically provide it with the libraries, but your app gets those plugged in its sandbox. Now, if you wanted to to do the programming environment, then you really can't do it in a standard browser because of the debugging issue. And it's not the threads are not as bad because the browsers have solutions, not the language, but individual browsers have solutions. But it's stack access that is a real pain to deal with in a reasonable way in JavaScript. So that I'd say that it's okay for developers that, okay, you can run in the browser so you're sure that your code is working the same way, but you probably have to run in a browser on your desktop where you've downloaded some extra, extension or plugin. But we want it to work, completely independently for the end user application. It's just a standard browser and they get a pile of JavaScript code. And that's pretty much working, but I can't release it.
Yeah, I understand. Well, and that's actually that's an important thing. Is that this is the core of this is an open source project that you started at a previous company that allowed you to open source all of this. And now that you're doing more development on it, we're going to see this more and more often. I think, given the prevalence of open source and the prevalence of open source going mainstream, is that people are going to add these cool features to things and then not be able to release them because of some policies and procedures at each of these large organizations. So I applaud your effort for at least trying to keep it as close to open source as you can. That's going to be really,
I expect we will release it, right? I'll be surprised if in the end it's bureaucracy and approvals and process, but I have sort of informal assurance from our CTO and stuff that we want to stay as open as possible. And so I expect that this will eventually get released, but it takes time and effort in every incarnation to convince people and go through these processes. So I'm still optimistic that we will get it out. It's just that, at the moment it's a bit of a problem. Oops.
So that's something that I'm sorry, I had my mic muted there, so I'm professional. I have my something I'm curious about is, as Randal said, obviously open source is becoming mainstream now, and I think we could have said that maybe a long time ago. It's becoming more and more mainstream. Is it difficult to convince these companies? I mean, you kind of referenced that there, but is it really difficult to convince people higher up in these large corporate entities that open source isn't going to destroy the company and all the rest of it?
Well, it varies with the individual and with the company and with the project, right? So generally, people are concerned that, is this going to damage the interests of the company in some way? And some people are paranoid and some people are not. My experience, for example, with another system I open sourced, which was StrongTalk, which was the system that basically was the precursor of the Hotspot JVM. It was a Smalltalk high-performance VM that we did as a startup, and when we were acquired by Sun, and I tried to get that open sourced out of Sun for years. And there was utter paranoia that somehow this would undermine Java because, yes, I think it was better, but it was nowhere near ready. It would require a lot of engineering before it was something people could use and would pose a threat. And despite this, it took years and years to get out first the sort of Smalltalk part of it, and then they still wouldn't release the VM, and eventually I got the VM released, and hardly anyone uses it. It's never posed a threat. Would it have posed a threat if we had done it earlier? I would like to think so, but I doubt it, actually. Usually it's just paranoia, and that can be very frustrating. It depends on who you're talking. They want to know, and again, there's people who want to just put the burden on proof, show us that it won't do any damage, and there's the other people who want to say, well, what good will it do us? And abstract arguments like community and appreciation and giving back to the stuff that you're using, they sometimes work and sometimes don't.
So I was curious about I know a lot of the work on Newspeak is licensed under keeping on the open source licensing theme under Apache 2, and is that what made you choose that license, and is it something that you hope to continue to release these other bits under in future?
I didn't choose it. This is something Cadence lawyers came up with. And given that it's relatively harmless, I chose BSD and I would have chosen MIT, whatever, right? But there was a slight level, they were more comfortable with that. And, rather than try and delay the release and jeopardize it and go argue with these people, we found that, Apache's fine. So in some sense, it basically lets you do whatever you want. right? The thing you want to avoid is anything that smacks of GPL, right? Even if it's lesser GPL, the words GPL are the kiss of death in industry. People do not want to hear, discuss, reason about whether or not. Certainly, the original GPL, they're absolutely right. This is not something that is of any use to you in industry. But even, whatever variant, no one really wants to go through the exercise of figuring it all out. It's just a poison pill. So that certainly was always out of the question. It would be nice if I could, that would let me force people perhaps to open source it again, but they'd never use it for anything and I never get anywhere because no one will, it's radioactive.
You know, it's sad that we're almost out of time, but I really wanted to hit that issue that you brought up just a moment ago. A lot of people don't know this about the history of the current Sun Java engine, that it actually has its roots back in Smalltalk. Can you talk about a little bit about Smalltalk and then Strongtalk and Hotspot again?
Okay, so I'll give you the quick history. Even before that, there's a language called Self, which I'm sure you know about. And Self is not Smalltalk, it's prototype based, but it's certainly in that culture and in that vein. And all this kind of adaptive JIT technology was really developed in Self. And Strongtalk was a project to take the Self technology and apply it to Smalltalk and make it more commercially viable. And it introduced lots of engineering innovations on top of what had been done in Self, basically mixed mode with an interpreter and a compiler and such. And that was a startup in the mid-90s. Back when, believe it or not, Smalltalk was commercially hot and IBM was investing in it and Wall Street was investing in it. And then Java came along and completely changed the picture. And when the startup was ready to be essentially sold after 2 years of work, the Smalltalk market for it had pretty much dried up. But we had the foresight to prepare a variant that dealt with Java. And that was way better than anyone else had, and Sun acquired us. And then essentially the Hotspot VM is sort of descended from the Strongtalk VM that is descended from the Self VM. And so these ideas, like an amazing amount of ideas that people don't know the history of, a lot comes from that Smalltalk world, whether it's refactoring or GUIs or agile development or, I can't remember off the top of my head all of them, but Smalltalk is a lovely environment because you can invent stuff because it's flexible. It's when you really try to go outside the box and do something non-standard that you hit the wall with mainstream things like Java. So yeah, this is just one of many technologies that come from that world that people don't realize.
Yeah, so I wanted to highlight this is because I'm always talking about the fact that really everything modern that we deal with in computers in terms of object-oriented programming, the whole Windows mice interface, even now things like, commercial successes like the iPad, were all really sort of invented back in the 1980 era and just sort of driven from that. And I love that you have the story now about how, the current Java VM is really the Self VM that you created with Hotspot, again, inspired by Smalltalk all the way back at the beginning.
Yeah, it's the code base, of course, is different, but the technologies and issues are very much the same. And, some of these techniques, it's typically in C++, and they're, usually, there's only so many ways to code them. It looks quite similar. And some of this is now in the JavaScript VMs. Some of this is in V8. The same ideas, not all of them, but again, that's why Lars, who worked on all of these VMs, Lars Bach, right? That's why he went to Google to do a fast JavaScript VM, because he knew how it could be done. And there were all these people who were skeptical, oh, you can't make it fast. And despite the fact that the language really is designed to be incredibly difficult to do anything with, in terms of performance or engineering or whatever, but they made it fast because, again, the same kind of techniques apply. It's sort of dynamic optimizations of various kinds.
Very cool, very cool. Well, we can keep going on talking for another hour or two about language design, but I'm running out of time, so I just wanted to thank you for coming on today's show. Again, are you looking for people in particular with particular skill sets? Because you've got the big microphone there. Can we ask? What do you want to ask my audience for?
Money? No. Let's see. We,
Yeah.
we need people. I think web skills are good. JavaScript kind of stuff is good, and but any kind of if someone wants to do some people have looked at porting this to the JVM. That's also possible, but you really have to know about bytecodes and invoke dynamic and all kinds of stuff. So people who are interested in languages, people who are smart and think outside the box, web skills in particular might be really handy. Linux GUI, there's occasionally people who are interested in that, even though I sort of wonder myself whether I'm fighting the last war on that. Yeah, anyone who's interested, basically. I don't have the feeling that I'm going to have a problem sorting out resumes and rejecting. So.
No, definitely not. So they go to newspeaklanguage.org and they can find you through that?
Yeah, they can, just search it. Google will find me. It's pretty easy. I think it's called newspeaklanguage.org. Yeah, whatever the website is. But Newspeak programming language, if you search for that, you'll find it.
Well, it sounds like a very fascinating thing. I'm anxious to play with it. Like everything I bring on this show, I want to go play with it right after I get done, and I never get time because I have to wait till the next show before I'm busy doing something else already. But it sounds interesting. It's new technology, fascinating technology. I like the idea of compiling it to JavaScript and everything. So I'm looking forward to seeing what comes as a result of this, and maybe I'll even get like an ounce of time I can squeeze in here and there to come help you out. I think it may be a lot of fun too. So thank you again for coming on today's show.
Thank you for inviting me.
Very good, very good. That was Gilad Bracha, who talked to us about Newspeak, his new take on Smalltalk and on programming languages in general, and sounds like he's got a lot of ambitious things. What do you think, Dan?
Yeah, really, really fascinating. I have to confess, I feel like I've just had a masterclass in language design from two experts here, so very privileged. It does seem really, really interesting, and I particularly liked your metaphor about open fields and as opposed to building brick structures and so on. Being a freedom-loving hippie, that appeals to me. So I may well have to look into that. Yeah.
Well, it's always been my impression with Smalltalk. It's just so malleable from the top to the bottom that you kind of go, well, I can fix this by making an array understand the go backwards method. And the thing is, you can do that. And it's actually, you've got to restrict yourself to stuff that you think you can maintain later. I think it's probably the key, and that it does take some discipline. That takes some time. So yeah, but it does feel a bit like playing sometimes. Like I'm just kind of hacking around, and now it just works. And I build these objects that are smart, and they talk to each other, and then they start talking to each other in interesting more and more ways. And then I got them all marching in unison, and they're all delivering what I want by the end of the day.
Yeah, I was also interested to hear some of the background between Java and the history between Java and Smalltalk. It makes me wonder why Smalltalk didn't quite, didn't take off as much as it should have done.
A couple of reasons. The most important reason I know about that is that at the time that Java came along, the two big Smalltalk vendors were charging $10,000 per development seat. And that's a real steep, no, 1,000, not 10,000. That sounds, wait, no. It's one of those. It's one of those. I know that makes a big difference, but it was something with a lot of zeros. And Java was essentially free for the JDK, and so you could download this and develop using it. And also, Sun had these really big, 2-page ads in all the big magazines saying, Java, write once, run anywhere, and it's easier to debug. And I say, and it does make people productive, but I like to tell people, and I'm probably wrong, I'm going to get hate mail for this, but I think Java makes everyone equally unproductive. I think that's really what that means. It sort of levels the playing field for everybody. So, yeah, I'm going to get the hate mail. I don't care. I hate Java. You already know that. So, so right about the time that Java was being rolled out, Smalltalk was actually being used really heavily, especially on Wall Street and stuff, because they'd have all these, big executive trades that they were doing, and they needed to be able to adapt quickly to the market. And in fact, the reason we got into this banking crisis is because they were able to build products using this giant Java or this giant Smalltalk application that's still being used today. All these derivative projects and stuff like that that created the U.S. housing bubble were all a giant Smalltalk program that did that. So, but Java came along again. Sun came along, had a real good promotion. I wish we had Simon Phipps on the show because it would have been nice to talk to him about Sun and the relationship at that time. I'll ask him next time he's on the show. But Sun came along and just really, splattered everybody and had all the, the people who decide, the managers who decide what language to pick by what two-page spread they read and what articles they read from Gartner about stuff and all that stuff. So, and so the technical guys wanted Smalltalk, but the managers wanted Java, and that just really sort of drove the market, and it's really sort of sad. But it is coming back. There's some resurgence from Smalltalk still. I mean, I thought last year was the big year, but it's still slowly growing up. There's a lot of really cool things happening in the Smalltalk world. I'm hoping Newspeak brings more people in that needed it to be talked about in terms of being modular, in terms of security, in terms of really being flexible, developable, and deployable, because now you know exactly what part of your application needs to be downloaded. I think there's going to be a lot of stuff that's going to come around like this. And when we're seeing other resurgences, like in the OLPC, that you've got a Smalltalk squeak activity. We're seeing also in like Scratch, the MIT language. Again, that's all Smalltalk all the way down. So people are playing with Smalltalk even if they don't realize it. We're getting squeak applications are running on the iPad and the iPhone. There's I think 6 different applications in the App Store that already are running as Squeak. So I think it's coming along. It's one of these quiet successes, and we're going to keep getting this as it goes along. So Smalltalk never really died. It just sort of became part of the fabric. That's all.
Yeah, it's like the Terminator. You can't kill it. Basically, it keeps coming back.
I'll be back. Yes. Yeah. I'll be Smalltalking. Yes. All right. So speaking of I'll be back, we're going to be back next week with that transition actually almost worked. I'm going to have to take that back because it's supposed to be more fun when it's really just like a non-transition. So anyway, so next week, it's the beginning of our Q2 schedule. We've got a lot of Q2 people in here. So we just scheduled this show a couple weeks ago. So next week I'll be talking with David Wheeler, who is a longtime FLOSS advocate. He's been doing a lot of papers and stories about open source software. And one of the things he's particularly an expert in is how open source software is being used at the Department of Defense. And actually he was instrumental in writing some of the papers to make that happen. So I'm really looking forward to that. Jason Huggins, immediately after that, you might know his name because he was the creator of Selenium, the Selenium web testing framework being used in all sorts of small and large organizations all around the world. He's going to come on and talk about that, and also his project Sauce Labs, which is a commercialization of Selenium. So we'll, again, have one of these ideas of, here's the free thing and here's the thing, how it's being used commercially and actually making people money. Emil Ivov, I don't know how to pronounce that. Emil Ivov, that sounds close enough, is going to talk to us about Jitsi. That's formerly called the SIP communicator. It's a SIP client that lets you basically be a VoIP client on your desktop. Lots of fun there. Philip Brown, Ben Walton, OpenCSW, CSW being the packaging system for Solaris. They're going to talk about this open repository for Solaris and Open Solaris packages and how they're doing all that. Dustin Mitchell just added to the schedule BuildBot. It's a Python-based building platform to make sure that you can build your packages and send them out. Matthew Flatt is going to talk to us about Racket. Racket, formerly called PLT Scheme. It's a training language for, it's sort of an educational training language. Scheme, of course, based on Lisp, and this is PLT Scheme, but they didn't like the name, so now they've changed it to Racket. It's an entirely different name. That should be fun. Again, we're going to talk about programming and education and teaching kids to program, and this is all going to be on that particular show. Koshuki Kawaguchi is going to talk to us about what used to be called Hudson, now called Jenkins, because again, Sun getting bought out by Oracle, they said, well, no, we own Hudson, but the community said, no, we want to do what we want to with it, so they forked it and renamed it Jenkins. He's going to talk about all that mess. He's the head of the Jenkins project now. Curtis Jewell coming on, a friend of mine that I've met at a couple of YAPC conferences. He's going to talk to us about Strawberry Perl, which is the Perl that runs on Windows and has full module installable capability, unlike the Windows version of Perl that came from ActiveState, which was very a closed system. And then somewhere on the schedule, probably off hours because he's in India and he wants to be to just have a phone call with him rather than doing our normal 9:30 slot. Sitaram Chamarte, something like that. Gitolite. Gitolite is like GitHub, except it's open source. It's actually free. You may not realize this, but even though a lot of open source projects are on GitHub, GitHub itself is not open source code. So Gitolite does the same thing. So you could put it in your organization or build a regional repository or something. That's going to be a lot of fun. So we've got a lot more people on the short list, still filling in a few more Q2 slots. So if there's somebody that you want on the show that I haven't mentioned and isn't on the list yet already, or even if they are on the list but they're further down the list, have the project leader email me and they go right up to the top of the list. That's how people get scheduled on the show. That's how today's show happened. So it's really simple. Just have the project leader email me and I will put them right at the top of the list. That's how I'm very simple that way. I'm actually very lazy that way. So if you want to follow me on Twitter, that's the best way to see where I'm doing and where I'm at. Like right now being in LA, I'm like looking for people to go hang out with for dinner and stuff. So I'll be tweeting where I'm at. That's Merlin, Merlyn on Twitter, and also on a lot of other things as well. Also, if you happen to be playing the game Trade Nations, I'm looking for more trade partners. I'm Randal Schwartz, all one word in that particular game. I got Leo Laporte playing it, so you can play right alongside me and Leo to basically buy and sell wood and lumber and build little things and stuff. It's like We Rule, but it's a lot better. So come along and play with us on that. That's the last of my plugs for right now. Dan, your Red Hole Radio thing is coming along well. How's that doing?
It is, yeah. That's one of the main things I want to plug today is the Rat Hole Radio Live event, which is a music event happening in Liverpool. So if anybody listening in or watching in the UK, near enough to Liverpool, wants to come along, it's the 24th, Sunday, the 24th of April, which is Easter Sunday. But, hopefully some people will come and celebrate Easter with us. We've got lots of great bands playing. We've got I Am Not Left-Handed, 20 Pound Sounds, which is my band, if you want to come and see me play, and a great singer-songwriter called Rob Warren, and all artists who use Creative Commons, which is a big passion of mine as well. So if you want to find out more, you can go to ratholeradio.org/gig, and there's also now a free EP up there. I made an EP of all the artists with a couple of songs each, basically, so people can get an idea and try before they buy, hopefully, and see if they actually like the music. So even if you can't make it to the gig, go and have a listen to the EP, and you might like it. It's all Creative Commons licensed, as I said. So if you head to ratholeradio.org/gig, you can find me there. At the weekend, I'm doing a keynote at an event called U Cubed, which stands for, let me get this right, Ubuntu Upstream Unconference. So U Cubed, there you go. Nice. Which is in Manchester, which is this Saturday, 2nd of April. It's going to be at Mad Lab in Manchester. So if you want to come along and see that, please go and have a look. If you search for U Cubed online, you'll find it. And obviously, you can keep up with Linux Outlaws at linuxoutlaws.com, and everything else I'm doing via Twitter and Identica and so on. And the username is Method Dan. That's like the two words, method and Dan, shoved together. So there you go. Can concatenate it, if you will. Keep it in programming speak.
Yeah, don't try to follow the one with just a single D, because that's somebody entirely different, right?
I don't even. Is that an account? I haven't even looked. Is that someone different? I should have registered.
You better get that one now before somebody else takes it away.
Yeah, I will do. Somebody's probably already done that by now. Yeah, maybe that could be my evil twin. I'll put that as my evil proprietary twin, maybe.
And let me also put in a plug. I tell you, people ask me all the time, like, Randal, you need more news on Floss Weekly. And I go, no, I don't want to be a news show. It takes a lot of work to make a news show. If you want a news show about open source software, go and check out Linux Outlaws. I'm always telling people that everywhere I meet. So.
Yeah, and we appreciate it. And we've got episode 200 coming up next week. So there you go, a big milestone for us there. So you can find out more about that at linuxoutlaws.com if you want to hear that. I've been wearing the T-shirt today for promotional purposes.
Indeed.
So there you
Must have been the cleanest shirt on the stack, right?
It is, yeah, basically.
I know how that works. Okay, good. Well, really interesting show today. I really enjoyed chatting with Gilad and talking about things that are close to me about Smalltalk and all that sort of stuff. So we'll have a lot more interesting shows, as you just heard about. A lot of really cool people coming up. So, feel free to join in, and we'll see you again next time on Floss Weekly.